Howdy everybody! In previous videos I've talked about the concept of building up instead of digging down. Well, there's another technique called Hügelkultur that does exactly this. So let's delve into that. Hügelkultur is a horticultural technique in which a mound is constructed. So we're building up, not digging down. A mound is constructed from decaying wood debris and compostable biomass, and that mound is later planted as a raised bed. It's a technique that has been fairly widely adapted by permaculture advocates as helping with soil fertility and, in particular, water retention. As for me, I never will use hugelkultur on this farm. Not because I have any particular prejudice against it or anything like that. In fact, just the opposite. Hügelkultur has been used successfully by many people, so I have no problem with that. But it simply is not for me, and I'll explain why later in the video. Now, if you're familiar with the term Hügelkultur, it likely is because you heard about it in association with Austrian naturalist Sepp Holzer or permaculture advocate Paul Wheaton. But the term Hügelkultur first appeared in a 1962 German gardening book by a guy named Hermann Andrea. And he was inspired by observing in the forest that tree saplings and other things tended to grow where other trees had fallen down. So wherever there was woody debris, that seemed to help things to grow. He also felt that Hügelkultur was a means of using debris like leaves and sticks and logs, instead of burning those, that they could have a beneficial use. And he was right. Trees that fall in the forest often become nurse logs, decaying and providing ecological facilitation to seedlings. As the decaying of the log progresses, its porosity increases, which allows it to retain water like a sponge, and then later give that water back into the environment. There are many recipes for building a hugel mound, but at the core of all of them is the use of large logs. That's where it starts. Then there's a layer of medium-sized branches. This is followed by a layer of small sticks and branches, and then comes a layer of leaves and other forest debris, followed by a layer of compost, and then finally a layer of garden soil and mulch. But let me emphasize that Hügelkultur is not a water harvesting technique. It is essentially a raised garden bed. A very specific one, but a raised garden bed nonetheless. Yes, because of all of the biomass that is used to construct the Hügelkultur mound, it has a tendency to retain water. But those mounds are not designed to rehydrate a landscape. Now, hugel mounds, by definition, are no-till because they're built on top of the existing terrain instead of digging down into it. But there's another benefit that comes from them. As decomposition of the organic matter used to make the hugel mounds occurs, it creates air pockets that mimic the effects of no-till. So it's beneficial in that respect as well. And of course, the decomposing material, the wood and the biomass, also house large numbers of beneficial microorganisms. Now, there's no point in getting dogmatic about how to create a hugel mound. There's all kinds of advice in social media about how to do it correct. But the point of the matter is, almost all of the methods that I've looked at seem to work to some extent for the people that use them. Simply do what works for you. Use the materials that are available to you and let it go at that. But there are a few tips that will help you. Number one, the type of wood that you use for the logs in the Hügelkultur is important. Do not use allelopathic species, such as the tree of heaven or black locust. These trees produce a chemical that can prevent other plants from growing around it, and that can affect how your hugel bed will work. Trees such as cedar, juniper, and Osage orange also are not recommended because they take too long to break down. They're very, very hard woods. So what should you use? Well, hardwood trees like oak, maple, and even apple are very good for hugel mounds because they kind of have a medium decomposition rate. You can also use various softwood tree species, but be aware that those are going to break down faster. And that means that your mound won't retain its shape as long. Now, an often voiced concern is that organisms involved in the decomposition cycle use nitrogen in their metabolic processes and therefore can potentially outcompete plants that you've put in the hugelkultur bed, initially making the bed nitrogen deficient and affecting the growth of those plants. Now, some argue that this can easily be remedied by adding nitrogen-rich materials such as kitchen scraps, manure, coffee grounds when you're building the hugel bed, and that this will offset that. I don't actually buy that, and the reason why is that more than likely all it's going to do is increase the population of the microorganisms that are doing the decomposition. In other words, they're going to use the nitrogen in both sources, in the biomass materials that you put and also in the nitrogen rich, and that's simply going to benefit them even more. The one thing that does seem to work really well though, and is highly recommended, when you finish the mound, simply cover it and let it sit there for, a month or two even, before you actually plant anything in it. And what will happen is that the mound will kind of equilibrate. There'll be an initial explosion of the microorganisms involved in decomposition, but then they'll kind of level off. And actually, over time, the decomposition will actually release nitrogen into the mound. So that seems to be the best solution for this. Well, we finally reached the point of the video where I'm going to divulge why I never will use hugelkultur on this farm. And rather than simply tell you, I'm going to show you with another permaculturist in Miami, Florida, is going to tell you her story.
I had a compost bin where I was throwing in like the kitchen scraps and some leaves and stuff. And I decided I wanted to use the concrete blocks to make a raised bed when I had the food forest. So I took out the concrete blocks and I moved out the compost, and in the same place I rearranged them to make a raised bed. And then I added some logs that I had about this big, and I added some sticks and leaves and stuff, and the logs weren't long, they were like sliced, so they were like this and then like about that thick. And then I placed them on the bottom and I finished it off with soil and I planted some things in there. So during the time that I had that raised hugelkultur bed, I had no idea that there was a problem with it until I started removing it. So I started taking apart the concrete blocks, and towards the back of the bed, near the fence, thousands of ants were coming out. Like so many ants. They were all living in some of the logs, the bigger round ones that were there, and they were just going crazy everywhere. It was a huge nest.
So as you could see, ants can be a significant problem. The same thing that attracts the beneficial microorganisms also attracts the ants. In other words, there's moisture, there's food there, and it seems like a good place to build a colony. But then there's another problem that she didn't mention, and that is subterranean termites. Now, up in the temperate regions, you don't have as many termite species as we do down here in the tropics. We have a lot of them. We have arboreal termites that build their nests up in the trees. We have the mound termites that build them on the ground. But then we also have subterranean termites that build their colonies underground. And if I tried to build a hugelkultur bed here using the logs, it would be very quickly colonized by termites. Those termites would simply eat the wood very quickly, and in the best case scenario, would reduce the effectiveness of the mound. The mound would simply fall, and it wouldn't be nearly as effective as it should be. In the worst case scenario, we have subterranean termites here, if you have trees next to your hugel mounds, that will infect the trees. And instead of eating dead wood, they eat live wood. They infect right through the root ball of the tree and go right up through the center, and they eat the tree from the center out. So if I wanted to build a Hügelkultur mound here, I would have to make sure that I don't have any trees around it or any kind of woody species. Not only would the termites colonize the mound itself and reduce its effectiveness, but they also would infect the trees nearby. And remember, in a lot of my videos, I talk about considering the context that you're in. And this is one of those instances. I have nothing against Hügelkultur, but the context here is not right for me because I'm in the tropics. So with that, I'm going to end the video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.